She had survived 11 months of silence of cold dinners, eaten alone of a husband who looked through her like she was made of glass. But the night he stood in front of every soul in Virginia and pointed at her and said, "Apologize to her." Something inside Elizabeth Carter didn't break. It snapped. And when a woman like Elizabeth snaps, she doesn't cry. She doesn't beg. She calls for her carriage. If this story moves you, if you've ever been told to shrink yourself for someone who never deserved you, please subscribe. Hit that notification bell and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Virginia summer of 1815. The night air at Ashford Manor smelled like honeysuckle, and something rotting underneath sweet on the surface wrong at the root. Lanterns burned along the long stone drive. Carriages lined up 3 deep. Inside the great house, the ballroom blazed with candlelight and the kind of laughter that belonged only to people who had never had to earn anything in their lives. Elizabeth Ashford née Carter stood at the top of the main staircase and watched it all. She wore ivory silk, pale and clean as fresh paper. Her dark hair was pinned back the way the ladies of Virginia wore theirs, in those days neat and severe, though a few curls had escaped near her temples from the heat. She was 23 years old and had been the Duchess of Ashford for almost a year. She had never once felt like it. She had learned in those 11 months how to be invisible. She had learned how to enter a room and take up less space than the furniture. How to smile at the right moments without meaning a single thing behind it. How to answer questions about the household accounts, the menus, the seating arrangements, all the things a duchess was supposed to manage without ever once being thanked for any of it. And she had learned, most importantly, how to watch. Below her the ballroom was full. Governor Randolph's wife was laughing too loudly near the east window. Judge Hartwell was deep in conversation with old Colonel Pierce. 2 men who had known the Ashford family for decades, and who had watched Elizabeth arrive at this manor, the way one watches a new piece of furniture arrive, noting it then forgetting about it. Elizabeth saw all of it. She always saw all of it. And she saw at the center of the room her husband, William Ashford. Duke of Ashford stood the way he always stood, like the floor had been built specifically to hold him. He was broad-shouldered and dark-haired, with that particular brand of English handsomeness that looked slightly too perfect, slightly too cold, as though it had been designed rather than born. He was 30 years old, and he moved through a room the way a stone moves through still water. Everything shifted around him, and he never noticed the ripples he left behind. He was laughing. Elizabeth could count on one hand the number of times she had seen him laugh in 11 months of marriage. She could not count the number of times she had seen him laugh with her. Standing at his side, her hand resting on his arm with the casual ownership of a woman who had never once questioned her right to be there, was Lady Victoria Bellamy. Victoria was 28, a widow of 2 years, and the most deliberately beautiful woman Elizabeth had ever seen. Everything about her was precise: her auburn hair, her green eyes, the practiced angle of her smile. She wore deep crimson, the color of something bold and unapologetic, and she wore it like armor. Elizabeth had met Victoria 3 days after arriving at Ashford Manor, when the woman had appeared at tea without an invitation, and William had welcomed her without explanation. He had never offered one. "You're going to catch a chill up there, ma'am." Elizabeth turned. Thomas the Ashford's oldest footman, a lean man with gray at his temples and 20 years of service in his eyes, stood a respectful distance behind her. He had a way of appearing without making a sound, which Elizabeth had first found unsettling and had since come to depend on. He was one of the only people in this house who ever spoke to her like she was a person, rather than a piece of furniture that happened to breathe. "I'm not cold, Thomas," she said quietly. "It's summer." "Yes, ma'am." He paused. "Mrs. Whitmore is looking for you. Something about the seating arrangement at the 3rd table." "The seating arrangement has been settled since Tuesday," Elizabeth said. "Mrs. Whitmore knows that." "Yes, ma'am, I believe she does." There was a silence between them, the kind that carried meaning. Elizabeth looked down at the ballroom again, at William, at Victoria's hand on his arm. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. Tell Mrs. Whitmore I'll be down shortly." He gave a small bow and disappeared the way he always did, quiet as smoke. Elizabeth stood alone for a moment longer. She made herself really look, at the man she had married, because her father had shaken hands with his solicitor across a mahogany desk in Richmond, 2 signatures and a sum of money that would keep the Carter family from losing everything. At the man who had stood at an altar with her and said words in front of God and witnesses, and had never not once said them like he meant them. At the woman who stood in Elizabeth's place in every room that mattered. She had cried about it in the beginning. In private, in the blue bedroom, she slept in alone, the one at the far end of the corridor, away from the Duke's chambers. She had cried the way you cry when you discover that what you were sold and what you purchased are not the same thing at all. And then she had stopped crying. Because crying, she had decided, was something you did when you still expected things to change on their own. Elizabeth had stopped expecting. And she had started watching. She descended the stairs. The first hour of the ball passed the way all balls in Virginia passed in the summer of 1815. Too warm, too bright, too loud, and full of conversations that meant nothing and decided everything. Elizabeth moved through it with the practiced grace of a woman who had been trained since girlhood to navigate exactly this kind of room. She spoke to the governor's wife about the humidity. She spoke to Judge Hartwell's daughter about a new milliner in Richmond. She refilled the punch bowl without making it look like she was refilling the punch bowl, which was a skill that required more concentration than anyone would ever know. And all the while, she watched Victoria. Victoria never looked directly at Elizabeth. That was part of her particular genius. She didn't need to. She had a way of dominating the room without appearing to fight for anything. She simply existed at its center, and everyone else orbited around her. And Elizabeth stood at the edge of the orbit and noted every single thing she saw. The way Victoria's hand moved to William's shoulder when she wanted his attention. The way William leaned just slightly, barely a degree toward her when she spoke. The way when Elizabeth approached any conversation where Victoria was present, there was a subtle but unmistakable shift. People moved. Eyes flicked sideways. The temperature of the room changed by 2 degrees, and not because of the weather. She's been working on this for months, Elizabeth thought, accepting a glass of lemonade from a passing tray with a smile she didn't feel. Maybe years. She's been building this, brick by brick. Duchess. She turned. Margaret Beaumont, a woman of 40-something with sharp eyes and an even sharper nose for other people's troubles, appeared at her elbow. Margaret was one of those women who claimed friendship the way some people claimed land, loudly, persistently, and with the full intention of profiting from the arrangement. "You look lovely tonight," Margaret said, which meant nothing. "Thank you, Margaret. So do you?" Elizabeth said, which also meant nothing. "Isn't it a wonderful party?" Margaret was watching the center of the room, watching William and Victoria with the particular expression of someone who knows they are witnessing something worth knowing about. "Your husband is such a gracious host." "He is," Elizabeth agreed pleasantly. "And Lady Bellamy." Margaret let the name sit for just a half-second too long. "She's looking particularly well this evening." "She is," Elizabeth said. "Would you excuse me? I believe the refreshment table needs attending." She left before Margaret could say another word. The trouble started near the east doors around 9:30. Elizabeth was speaking with Reverend Caldwell and his wife when she heard the change in the room's noise. Not louder exactly. Different. The particular quiet that isn't quiet that settles over a crowd when something has happened and everyone is deciding how to respond to it. She turned. Victoria was standing in the center of the room. She had one hand pressed to her chest in a gesture of injury so practiced it should have been performed on a stage. Several people had gathered around her. William was moving toward the commotion with the long-legged stride he used when something was wrong. Elizabeth moved toward it too, though no one had called for her. She arrived at the edge of the circle just in time to hear Victoria say, in a voice pitched perfectly to carry, "Couldn't believe it." She simply reached out and... Victoria pressed her lips together, shaking her head as though too overcome to continue. "What happened?" William demanded. Victoria looked up at him. Her green eyes were bright, and Elizabeth, watching from the outside of the circle, thought, she doesn't even need to force the emotion. She's been planning this, and she's genuinely enjoying it. It's nothing, Victoria said with the deliberate smallness of someone who wants to be pressed. Victoria! William's voice was sharp. The Duchess! Victoria paused. Let the word land. Let every head in the room turn toward Elizabeth, who stood at the outer edge of the circle with a glass of lemonade in her hand and an absolutely neutral expression on her face. The Duchess made certain remarks to me near the garden doors a short while ago. I'm sure she didn't mean, I'm sure it was only, but the things she said were... She stopped, pressed her lips together again. What things? William said. He's not looking at me, Elizabeth noted. He hasn't looked at me once. He looked at her the moment he walked in, and he hasn't moved his eyes. She questioned my character, Victoria said softly. My reputation, in front of several guests. A murmur went through the crowd. Not loud. Worse than loud, it was the murmur of people who have already chosen a side. That's not what happened, Elizabeth said. Her voice was calm. She was surprised in a distant way by how calm it was. She stepped forward into the circle, and the crowd opened for her, the way crowds open for the person they've already decided to observe, rather than defend. I spoke 2 sentences to Lady Bellamy near the garden doors, Elizabeth continued. I asked her whether she intended to be present for all 3 days of the house party, and I said that I hoped her travel arrangements were comfortable. That is the entirety of what I said. She looked at Victoria steadily. Victoria looked back at her with those perfectly calibrated green eyes and said gently, sadly, with the kind of sorrow that costs nothing. You know that isn't true, Elizabeth. The use of her first name, without title, in front of every important person in Virginia. Elizabeth registered it the way you register a slap, the awareness of the intention before the impact arrives. Lady Bellamy, she corrected quietly. That is what I said. She's been so unkind, Victoria said, turning back to William. Not just tonight, for months. I've said nothing because I didn't want to cause trouble for you, William, but tonight... Her voice caught beautifully. Tonight was simply too much. The crowd was very quiet now. Elizabeth looked at her husband. William was looking at Victoria, and Elizabeth watched his jaw tighten, the way it always did when he was deciding something. She had learned to read him in small ways, not because he had ever offered himself to be read, but because she had spent 11 months paying attention when no one noticed her doing it. He was going to side with Victoria. She knew it the way she knew the angle of light through the east windows at 7 in the morning. Not because she had proof in that moment, but because she had been watching long enough to know the shape of what came next. She was right. William turned to her, and what he said next, those words spoken in front of every witness in that glittering, overheated room, would be the thing Elizabeth carried with her for the rest of her life. Not because they broke her, but because they were the exact moment she stopped allowing things to break her. Elizabeth, he said. His voice was low and even, and utterly certain. Apologize to her. Silence. Not the quiet of people not speaking. The silence of people holding their breath. Elizabeth looked at her husband. She took one long moment, one single breath, and she saw him clearly. Not the man she had hoped he might become. Not the husband she had told herself in her weaker moments was capable of seeing her. Not the person she had, God help her, occasionally caught herself almost caring for. Just a man, standing in a room, who had looked at her and chosen wrong. No, Elizabeth said. The single word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. William's eyes sharpened. Elizabeth. No, she said again, and her voice was very quiet and very clear, and it carried the way quiet voices do when a room is paying close attention. I will not apologize for something I did not do. This is not the time for... I spoke 2 sentences, Elizabeth said. I told you what they were. If Lady Bellamy remembers them differently, that is a matter between her memory and her conscience, and neither of them requires my apology. She could feel the room around her, the weight of all those eyes, the held breath of people who had come to a summer ball and were receiving instead something they would discuss for the rest of the year. William stepped toward her. When he spoke, his voice dropped just slightly. Man to wife, the particular register of a person who expects to be obeyed. "You will apologize," he said. "Now, in front of these people." Elizabeth looked at him for one long moment, and then something changed in her face. People who were watching would later struggle to describe it. It wasn't anger exactly. It wasn't tears. It was closer to the expression a person wears when they have been waiting for something difficult for a very long time, and it has finally arrived and the waiting is over. She reached up. Her fingers found the ring on her left hand, the Ashford family ring, gold and emerald, too large for her finger, when he'd placed it there, which she'd had adjusted and had worn every day since, as though it meant something. She removed it. It made no sound when she set it on the small table beside her. And somehow, the absence of sound made it louder than anything else in the room. "Bring my carriage," Elizabeth said. She said it to Thomas, who was standing near the east wall, who was always near when she needed him, and who gave one small nod and slipped out through the side door with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that something significant had just happened. "Elizabeth." William's voice was different now. Not commanding. She couldn't name what it was. She picked up her gloves from the same small table. She pulled them on one and then the other with the steady hands of someone who has already made their decision and is simply completing the motion. "I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening," she said to the room in general with perfect composure. She did not look at Victoria. She did not look at William again. She walked to the front doors. The crowd parted. No one said a word. She moved through the silence of 30 people who had come to see a summer party and were watching something they hadn't expected, something they didn't have quite the right words for yet. The night air outside was heavy with summer heat, thick with the smell of honeysuckle and horses and the dark Virginia pines. Thomas was already there. The carriage stood waiting. Lamps lit the driver patient on his box. "Thank you, Thomas," Elizabeth said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and his voice was very careful. The way people are careful when they have feelings they were not hired to express. She stepped up into the carriage. The door closed, and she sat alone in the dark interior, and the carriage began to move, and the lights of Ashford Manor fell away behind her, and she did not watch them go. She sat very straight. She had one small bag. She had packed it that morning, because she had known with the certainty of a woman who has been paying close attention that something was coming, and that she would need to be ready. She didn't know it would come tonight, but she had been ready. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was not crying. What she was, what she had been in truth for several months now, was done. But here is what no one in that glittering, overheated ballroom knew. Here is what William Ashford did not know, and Victoria Bellamy did not know, and every well-dressed, breath-holding witness in that room did not know. Elizabeth Carter had not spent 11 months simply learning to be invisible. She had spent 11 months learning everything. She knew about the accounts. She knew about the letters. She knew about the correspondence between Victoria Bellamy and the Ashford family solicitor that had begun 6 months before William's mother had died. She knew about the money that had moved quietly and steadily, like water finding a crack in old stone. She had the letters. She had the records. She had spent 3 months quietly, carefully, systematically extracting proof from the very house she had just walked out of, and she carried it with her, now folded into the lining of the small bag on the seat beside her. The carriage rolled through the dark Virginia night. Elizabeth sat very straight and breathed the heavy summer air and thought about her next move with the same calm, methodical precision she had brought to everything she had done in this house. She had not left because she was broken. She had left because she was finished waiting, and in the morning the work would begin. But for now, in the carriage in the dark, she let herself feel one thing. Not anger, not grief, not the particular cold satisfaction of a decision made. She let herself feel the weight of that ring, the absence of it, the lightness of her left hand without it. She pressed her bare fingers together in her lap and sat with that lightness for a long time. And when the carriage finally stopped, when Thomas opened the door and handed her down in front of her aunt's house in Richmond, she straightened her shoulders, tilted her chin, and walked through the door like a woman who had just remembered something she had briefly forgotten. That she belonged to herself. She always had. What they did not know, what no one in that room would understand until much later, was that Elizabeth Ashford had learned something in 11 months of watching from the edges of a world that refused to see her. She had learned that power does not announce itself, it simply acts. And Elizabeth Carter had only just begun. Elizabeth did not sleep that night. She sat in the small chair by the window of her aunt's spare bedroom in Richmond, still wearing the ivory silk, and she did not sleep, and she did not cry, and she did not allow herself to think about the ring she had left on that table. She thought instead about what came next. She had always been better at what came next than at what had already happened. That was perhaps the only useful thing her father had ever taught her, not in words, but by example. Franklin Carter had been a man who looked backward constantly, who mourned every wrong turn, who spent the last years of his life cataloging his own failures with the obsessive attention of a man with nothing better to do. And Elizabeth had watched him, and decided very quietly, very early, that she would not become him. So she sat in the chair and she thought forward. Her Aunt Clara Whitfield had opened the door at 11 o'clock at night without asking a single question. She had taken one look at Elizabeth's face and said, "The blue room is made up." And that had been the end of it. Clara was 61 years old and had been married twice, once badly, once well, and she understood without explanation the particular expression a woman wears when she has made a decision that cannot be unmade. In the morning, Clara brought coffee and set it on the small table without speaking, and sat across from Elizabeth with her own cup, and they drank in silence for a while. "Well," Clara said finally. "I need 3 days," Elizabeth said. "Maybe 4. "You can have as many as you like." "I don't need more than 4. Elizabeth set down her cup. "I need to speak with someone, a solicitor, not the one tied to the Ashford estate." Clara's eyebrows rose very slightly. "There's a man named Garrett on Canal Street. He handled my second marriage. He's discreet." "Good." Elizabeth folded her hands on the table. "I also need paper, and ink, and I'd prefer if no one knew I was here yet." "No one will hear it from me," Clara said. And then after a pause, "Are you all right?" Elizabeth considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things. "I think," she said, "that I am more all right now than I have been in 11 months. Clara studied her for a moment. Then she nodded, once the decisive nod of a woman who has navigated difficult things and recognizes the particular posture of someone doing the same. "Then let's get you some paper," she said. The documents were in the lining of the bag. Elizabeth had begun collecting them 7 months ago, on a Tuesday in late October, when she had gone looking for the household accounts and found tucked behind the ledger in the study's lower drawer a letter she was not meant to read. She had almost not read it. That was the truth of it, and she would admit it to herself even if she admitted it to no one else. She had held the envelope for a full 30 seconds, feeling the weight of it before she opened it. Because she had known with the instinct of a woman who has been paying attention that whatever was inside would change something. And there is always a moment before you know a difficult truth when you can still choose not to know it. When ignorance is still available, like a door you haven't walked through yet. She had opened the letter. It was from Victoria Bellamy to the Ashford family's solicitor, a man named Coldwell, and it was dated 14 months ago, 2 months before William's mother had died. The language was careful, the kind of careful that knows it is being careful, the kind that says nothing directly but implies everything. Victoria wrote about arrangements and the matter we discussed, and ensuring that the transition proceeds without complications. She mentioned a specific sum, $4,000, and described it as the final portion of what was agreed. Elizabeth had read it twice. She had put it back. She had gone to bed that night and lain awake for 3 hours thinking about what she knew and what she didn't know, and what the difference was between suspicion and proof. And then she had started looking. Over the following months, she had moved through the Ashford estate with the careful patience of someone who is not looking for anything in particular, because a person looking for something particular is always noticed. She had learned the household the way water learns the shape of a vessel, by going everywhere quietly without force. She had chatted with the housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle, about the history of the estate. She had asked Thomas casually over the course of many small conversations about the years before her arrival. She had spent evenings in the library not reading the books that were meant to be read, but examining the ones that weren't old. Correspondence, old accounts, the administrative records of a household that went back 30 years. She had found 5 more letters. She had found 2 sets of accounts, one the household was meant to see, and one it wasn't. And she had found in a small locked box behind a false panel in the late Duchess's sitting room, a room Elizabeth had been told was kept locked out of respect for William's grief, a journal. The journal belonged to Catherine Ashford, William's mother. And what it contained was not grief, and not memory, and not the private reflections of a woman coming to the end of a quiet life. What it contained was fear. Elizabeth had read it in one sitting in that locked room, with her heart hitting the inside of her chest like a fist against a door. Catherine Ashford had been afraid of Victoria Bellamy for the last 18 months of her life. Not in a vague way. Not in the way a woman is sometimes afraid of a rival or an enemy. In the specific documented way of a woman who believes she is being systematically removed from her own life. She has turned William against me, the journal read. He does not see it. He cannot see it. He has always been blind where she is concerned, since they were young, since before she married Bellamy, since before any of this. I have tried to tell him, and he does not hear me. I think he believes I am old and jealous and confused. I am none of those things. I know what I am seeing. And later. The accounts are wrong. I checked them myself. I am not a fool about money. Whatever else I may be, and the accounts are wrong in a way that benefits only one person, and it is not anyone in this family. And then near the end, the entry that had made Elizabeth sit very still for a very long time. I am afraid of what will happen when I am gone. Not to William. William can take care of himself, or he believes he can, which is not the same thing. I am afraid for whoever comes after me, whoever he marries. She will not allow it to be easy for her. She will make certain of it. Catherine Ashford had died 3 months after that entry. A fall, the family had said. A tragic accident. A staircase at night in a house she had lived in for 30 years. Elizabeth sat in her aunt's spare bedroom in the early morning light and spread the documents on the table in front of her and thought about the woman who had written those words and what they cost her to write and what had happened after she wrote them. And she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not anger exactly, something older than anger, something closer to grief. She had never met Catherine Ashford. Catherine had died 6 months before the marriage was arranged. But sitting here with this woman's words in her hands, Elizabeth felt the particular bond that forms between women across time and circumstance, the bond of having seen the same thing, having been afraid of the same thing, having been disregarded by the same eyes. I am afraid for whoever comes after me. I know, Elizabeth said quietly to the empty room. Then she picked up her pen and began to write. She met with the solicitor Garrett on Thursday morning. He was a small man neatly dressed with reading spectacles and the careful manner of someone who has spent a long career learning not to be surprised. He read through the documents she placed before him without changing expression, which she appreciated. When he was finished, he took off his spectacles and polished them with his handkerchief and put them back on and looked at her. "Where did you obtain these?" he asked. "They were in the house," Elizabeth said. "The household accounts were in the study. The letters were in the same location. The journal belonged to the late Duchess and was in her private sitting room. You had access to all of these areas." "I was the Duchess of Ashford," Elizabeth said evenly. I had access to the entire estate. He absorbed this. These letters, if they are authentic, and I am not yet saying they are, imply a financial arrangement between Lady Bellamy and the Ashford solicitor Coldwell that predates and may have influenced. He paused. They imply a great deal. Yes, Elizabeth said, they do. And the journal? He paused again. Longer this time. The journal is the private record of a woman who believed she was being deliberately isolated and defrauded, Elizabeth said. I am not a lawyer, Mr. Garrett. I am not going to tell you what it proves or doesn't prove. I am telling you what I found and what I believe, and I am asking you what I can do about it. Garrett looked at her for a moment. Then he said, You understand that moving against Lady Bellamy or against Coldwell will require— I understand it will be difficult, Elizabeth said. I understand I am a woman of 23, in a society that is not accustomed to taking women of 23 seriously on matters of financial fraud or anything else. I understand that my husband, who is the head of the affected household, has not yet been informed of what I found, because I needed to understand it myself before I could explain it to anyone. I understand all of that, Mr. Garrett. She held his gaze. I am asking you what I can do, not what will be easy. There was a silence. Then Garrett said very carefully, Let me examine these documents more thoroughly. Of course, Elizabeth said, and folded her hands and waited. He sent word on Friday afternoon, 3 lines written in his neat, precise hand. The accounts appear to document a systematic diversion of Ashford estate funds over a period of approximately 4 years. I have located a secondary discrepancy that may warrant further investigation. I believe you should see this. She went back to his office. What he showed her was a property record. A parcel of land 20 miles south of the Ashford estate registered in the name of a company she had never heard of. But the registration signature, the witness who had signed to verify the transaction, was Coldwell, and the date was 11 days after Catherine Ashford's death. Land that should have passed to the estate, Garrett said quietly, under the terms of the late Duke's will. Elizabeth looked at the document. How much? At current value? Perhaps $12,000. She sat with that number for a moment. $12,000 was not a number that happened by accident. $12,000 was a number that required planning. What do I do with this? She asked. Carefully, Garrett said. Very carefully. He looked at her over his spectacles. You said your husband doesn't know. He doesn't. He will need to eventually. This affects his estate, his inheritance. I know. Elizabeth looked at the property record. But I need him to see it correctly, not filtered through Victoria Bellamy's version of what it means, not explained away before he has a chance to understand it. That will require timing, Elizabeth said. Yes, I know. She stood up and gathered the documents and put them carefully back into her bag and picked up her gloves from the chair. Mr. Garrett, she said, I would like you to begin preparing a formal account of what you've found, something that could be presented if necessary in a public setting. He blinked. A public setting. I don't know yet when or where, Elizabeth said, but I want to be ready. She pulled on one glove, then the other. She has been ready for years. I intend to catch up. Back at Clara's house, the first visitor arrived. Elizabeth was in the sitting room going through her notes when Clara appeared in the doorway with the expression of a woman delivering news she hasn't decided how to present yet. There's a young man outside, Clara said, from the Ashford estate. He says he was sent by the housekeeper. Elizabeth looked up. Thomas? No, a younger one. James, I think. He has a letter. Elizabeth set down her pen. Send him in. The boy James was perhaps 16. One of the junior footmen came in with his hat in his hands and his eyes carefully aimed at the floor. He held out a sealed envelope. Elizabeth took it, broke the seal, and read. It was from Mrs. Doyle, the housekeeper. Written in the cramped, careful hand of a woman who had not written many letters and was choosing every word with deliberate attention. Your Grace, I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing because I believe you ought to know that since Tuesday evening, there has been considerable activity at the estate. Lady Bellamy has been present every day. The staff have been told that arrangements are being made for an extended stay. I am not in a position to say more in a letter, but I wanted you to know that there are those of us here who remember things as they were and are paying attention to how they are now. Please be careful, Your Grace. There are people in this house who are not what they appear to be, and I do not say this without reason. Your obedient servant, Mrs. E. Doyle. Elizabeth read it twice. Then she said to the boy, "Tell Mrs. Doyle that I received her letter and I am grateful. Tell her to go about her duties as normal and not to do anything that would draw attention. Tell her," she paused, "tell her that I am aware of the situation and I am not finished." The boy nodded seriously in the way of young people who understand they are carrying something important. "Yes, Your Grace," he said and left. Clara appeared in the doorway again. "Well, Victoria is moving faster than I expected," Elizabeth said. Clara's eyes sharpened. "What does that mean for you?" Elizabeth looked at the letter again. Victoria present every day. Staff being told about an extended stay. Arrangements being made. She thought about timing, about the difference between being ready and being fast enough. "It means," she said, "that I have less time than I thought." That was when the second thing happened. The thing Elizabeth had not planned for. She was sitting alone in Clara's sitting room late that evening, working through the account documents one more time, when she heard the knock at the front door. Not the service entrance, the front door, which meant it was not a servant and not a delivery, and meant that whoever it was had chosen to arrive at the front door of Clara Whitfield's house at 8 o'clock on a Friday evening, which was not the behavior of someone who wasn't sure they wanted to be seen. She heard Clara's voice low and guarded in the entryway. Then a man's voice. Elizabeth knew the voice immediately. Of course she did. She had heard it nearly every day for 11 months. She had lain awake in a room at the end of a corridor, listening for the sound of it, and telling herself she wasn't listening. She stood up. She did not run. She did not hide. She was not the kind of person who did either of those things, and she was not about to start tonight. She walked to the sitting room doorway and stood in it and waited. William came through the hall with Clara behind him, and Clara's expression was the expression of a woman who is deeply uncertain whether she has made the right decision, but who is going to stand her ground regardless. "He asked to see you," Clara said to Elizabeth with the kind of evenness that meant, "Say the word and I will remove him." Elizabeth looked at her husband. He looked, and she catalogued this with the careful attention she gave everything different from how he had looked 2 nights ago. Not destroyed, not humbled, not arrived in repentance. She had not expected any of those things, and she was relieved not to have to deal with them. He looked, if she were being honest, like a man who was not sleeping well and was trying to look like he was sleeping fine and not entirely succeeding. "William," she said. She did not step back from the doorway. She did not invite him in. "Elizabeth." He stopped a few feet away. He glanced at Clara, then back at her. "Could we speak privately?" "No," Elizabeth said. And then, because she was not a cruel person, even when she was a careful one, "Clara is my family. Anything you need to say can be said in front of her." His jaw tightened. That old reflex. She knew it now the way she knew the angle of morning light. "I came to ask you to return to the estate," he said. "The situation has—" He paused. "There are appearances to maintain. The staff need direction. There is the matter of the Hargrove dinner next week, and the—" "No," Elizabeth said. A beat of silence. "Elizabeth, I understand that Tuesday evening was—" "Do you?" she asked, not sharply, genuinely. Her voice was so calm it seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. "What do you understand about it exactly?" He was quiet for a moment. She watched him trying to find the right words and failing to find them, and she thought, "This is the problem, isn't it? He has never had to find words for me before." "I understand that the situation was handled poorly," he said finally. "Handled poorly," Elizabeth repeated. "The request I made of you was—" He stopped again. "Finish it," she said. Perhaps not the most prudent course, he said. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Catherine's journal, about the letters, about the property record with Coldwell's signature, about the 4 years of systematic careful theft, and the woman who had seen it and been afraid and died before she could tell anyone who could help. She thought about the $12,000. She thought about the word prudent. I will not be returning to the estate, she said. Not yet, and not for the reasons you're thinking. He frowned. What does that mean? It means, Elizabeth said carefully, that there are things in that house you need to know. Things that don't have anything to do with Tuesday evening, or with me, or with whatever you have told yourself this week about why I left. Things that have to do with your family, and your estate, and your mother. The mention of his mother did something to his face. Something she hadn't seen before. A flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Something between surprise and old pain. My mother, he said. There is a journal, Elizabeth said. In a locked box, in her sitting room. You should read it. A long silence. You went into her sitting room, he said, not accusing, something else. It was not locked from the inside, Elizabeth said, and I was the mistress of that house, and I was looking for something I needed to find. What were you looking for? The truth, Elizabeth said. It turns out your mother had been looking for it too. He left 40 minutes later. He had not raised his voice. She had not raised hers. They had stood in Clara's sitting room, like two people conducting a negotiation rather than a marriage. And Elizabeth thought that was in a strange way more honest than most of the conversations they had managed in 11 months of living in the same house. He hadn't believed her fully. She hadn't expected him to. But she had watched his eyes when she mentioned the accounts, when she mentioned Coldwell's name, when she mentioned the property record and its date 11 days after his mother's death. She had watched him very carefully, and she had seen the exact moment when something in him went still. Not anger, not denial. The particular stillness of a person who has been suspicious of something for a long time and has just heard someone else say it out loud. He knows something, she thought, as the sound of his carriage faded down Clara's street. He doesn't know what he knows yet. But there's something already there. Something he's been pushing down. Clara appeared in the doorway. Well, he'll go back and look, Elizabeth said. He can't not now that I've said it. And when he finds it, Elizabeth looked into the bag on the table, the documents, the journal, 7 months of quiet, careful, invisible work. When he finds it, she said, he is going to have to decide what kind of man he is. She sat back down at the table. And I intend to be ready for either answer, she said, and picked up her pen. 3 miles away, in a candlelit room at Ashford Manor, Victoria Bellamy sat across from the man she had kept in her orbit for the better part of 10 years and watched his face and decided she needed to move faster. She had heard about the solicitor on Canal Street. Her sources in Richmond were good. They always had been. She's been busy, said the man sitting across from her. Coldwell, who wore his composure the way some men wore clothes they didn't quite fit present, but under strain. She's been busy for months, Victoria said. I simply underestimated how organized she'd been about it. What does she have? Victoria looked at the candle. The letters likely. Possibly the accounts. If she got into Catherine's room, and apparently she did the journal. Coldwell's composure thinned. The journal is a problem, Victoria agreed. But not an insurmountable one. She looked at him with the steady green gaze she had spent a lifetime calibrating. Catherine is dead. Journals can be challenged. A 23-year-old woman with no legal standing in this estate. She's his wife, Coldwell said. For now, Victoria said. A silence. What are you suggesting? Coldwell asked, and his voice had a careful quality. The quality of a man who wants to know the answer and also wants to be able to say later that he hadn't asked for it. Victoria stood up. She moved to the window. Outside, the Virginia summer night pressed its heat against the glass. I'm not suggesting anything, she said. I'm planning. She turned. William came back tonight without her. That tells me something. He came back here to this house without going to see the solicitor or the magistrate or anyone else, which means he's uncertain, which means she said something that rattled him but didn't convince him. Her eyes were steady. We have a window, small but present. What kind of window? The kind, Victoria said, where we act before she does. She turned back to the window. Outside, the honeysuckle still hung thick on the summer air. It had smelled the same the night she had first come to this house years ago, when William had looked at her like she was everything, and she had looked at him and calculated what he was worth. She had not changed her mind since then. She had simply had to be more patient than she expected. Set up a meeting with Hartwell, she said, and with the Reverend, and anyone else whose opinion still matters in this county. She paused. If she wants to present her evidence somewhere, we should make sure the room is already arranged. Coldwell was quiet for a moment. And William? He asked. Victoria looked at the candle. William, she said, is going to have to choose. He always has to choose eventually. She picked up her own glass. He has always chosen me. She said it the way she said most things, with total certainty, with the smooth surface of a woman who does not question her own conclusions. But later alone, she would think about Elizabeth Ashford standing in that ballroom with her bare left hand and her steady voice and the particular expression of someone who was not running, and Victoria would feel very briefly, very carefully before she put it away, the thing she had felt only rarely in her life. Uncertainty. She put it away quickly, but it had been there. On Saturday morning, Clara's young housemaid knocked on Elizabeth's door and said, "Your Grace, there's a boy here from the estate again." Elizabeth set down her coffee. "Send him in." It was James again, the junior footman, still holding his hat in both hands, but this time his expression was different, less careful, more urgent. "From Thomas, Your Grace," he said, and held out not a letter, but a small folded piece of paper. 3 words in Thomas's cramped, familiar hand. He read it. Elizabeth looked at the paper for a long moment. 3 words, no more than that. But she knew exactly what they meant. William had gone to the sitting room. He had found the journal. He had read what his mother had written in the last months of her life about the woman who had been standing in his ballroom 3 nights ago, accepting his protection while his wife stood at the edge of the circle. He had read it. She breathed in slowly, then out. "Thank you, James," she said. "Tell Thomas?" She thought for a moment. "Tell Thomas that timing matters." The boy nodded, turned and left. Elizabeth sat alone for a while. Outside, a cardinal landed on the window ledge and sat there for a moment, red and bright and briefly perfect, before flying away. She picked up her pen. She had a great deal more work to do, and she was beginning to believe just enough time to do it. The letter arrived Sunday morning. Not from Thomas. Not from William. Not from anyone Elizabeth had been expecting. It came in a plain envelope, no return address, delivered by a boy she had never seen before, who handed it to Clara's housemaid, and disappeared before anyone thought to ask his name. Clara brought it in herself, turning it over in her hands, with the careful suspicion of a woman who has lived long enough to know that anonymous letters are rarely good news. Elizabeth broke the seal. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Neat, but pressured the hand of someone writing quickly, someone writing afraid. "Your Grace. I do not sign this letter because I cannot afford to. I work in the office of Coldwell and Associates on Broad Street, and I have worked there for 6 years, and I have seen things I should not have seen and said nothing, because I could not afford to say anything. I am saying something now because last week Coldwell asked me to alter certain records, and I will not do it. I don't know if what you have is enough. I think there is more. I think you should look at the Bellamy estate accounts from the year before last, the ones filed with the county recorder. I think you should look at who signed them. I will not say more than this. Please be careful. He is not a gentle man when he believes he is cornered." Elizabeth read it twice. She set it down on the table. She picked up her coffee and drank it without tasting it, and thought about the word cornered. She thought about what it meant that Coldwell had asked someone in his own office to alter records, and that person had written to her instead. She thought about what it meant that someone was afraid enough not to sign their name, but brave enough to write it all. She thought about timing. "Clara," she said. Clara appeared from the doorway as though she had been waiting, which she probably had. "I need to go to the county recorder's office," Elizabeth said. "Today." "It's Sunday," Clara said. "I know." Elizabeth stood up. "Do you know anyone who works there?" Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she said with the resigned practicality of a woman who has accepted that her niece operates outside normal business hours. "My neighbor Ambrose Fitch was the deputy recorder for 20 years. He still goes in on Sundays to feed the cat." Elizabeth looked at her aunt. "You're remarkable, Clara." "I'm old," Clara said dryly. "It's the same thing." Ambrose Fitch was a spare white-haired man of 70 who cared enormously about procedural correctness and very little about the social dynamics of Virginia's gentry, which made him, in Elizabeth's current situation, almost exactly the right person to know. He let them in through the back door, muttering about Sundays and young people, and the general decline of respect for the working week, and he led Elizabeth to the records room with a lamp and the air of a man doing something he considered mildly irregular, but not wrong. The Bellamy estate accounts were where the anonymous letter said they'd be. Elizabeth found them in 20 minutes. The filing for the year before last, the year before Catherine Ashford's death, showed a series of transactions between the Bellamy estate and a land management company. The same company name she'd seen on the property record Garrett had shown her, the one registered on land that should have gone to the Ashford estate. But the signature at the bottom of the Bellamy filings was not Coldwell's, it was Williams. Elizabeth stood very still. The lamp threw its warm light over the page, and the signature sat there on the paper unmistakable, the broad angular W she had watched him sign household documents with 100 times over 11 months. William Ashford, Duke of Ashford. She read the page 3 more times. She made herself breathe steadily. She was not going to make assumptions. She was not going to decide what this meant until she understood what it was. What it appeared to be was William's signature authorizing the transfer of funds into a company that subsequently purchased land that should have belonged to his own estate, which could mean he was complicit, which could mean he was being used, which could mean she made herself stop. "Can I make a copy of this?" she asked Fitch, who was feeding the cat in the corner with serene detachment. "There's paper and ink on the desk," he said without turning around. She copied it exactly word for word, signature for signature, and folded the copy into her bag next to everything else. On the walk back to Clara's house, she did not say a single word. Clara, to her credit, did not ask. It was Garrett who made sense of it. She was back in his office first thing Monday morning, the copy of the filing in front of him, and she watched his face while he read it, and she waited. He set it down slowly. "This signature," he began. "I know what it looks like," Elizabeth said. "It authorizes." "I know what it authorizes. Tell me what it means." She kept her voice steady. "Is he complicit? Is he being forged? Is this something done without his knowledge?" Garrett picked up his spectacles, polished them, put them back on. She had noticed he did this when he needed a moment to organize his thoughts, and she had learned to let him do it without rushing him. "The signature itself I cannot verify," he said. "But the date on this document..." He tapped it. "This was filed 8 months before Lady Bellamy began the transactions that appear in the accounts you showed me last week, which means either the Duke was involved from the beginning and agreed to arrangements that were later used against his own interests." He paused. "Or his signature was obtained under different pretenses, used for a document he didn't know was what it was." Elizabeth sat with this. "Is that possible?" she asked. "Signing something without knowing what it is?" "For a man who trusted his solicitor completely," Garrett said, "it is very possible." Coldwell had been the Ashford family solicitor for 22 years. There were likely documents the Duke signed as a matter of routine without examining each one closely. He looked at her over his spectacles, especially if someone ensured he was distracted at the time. Someone like Victoria, Elizabeth thought. Victoria, who had been present at the estate in William's orbit in his blind spot for years. She thought about Catherine's journal. He has always been blind where she is concerned. She thought about William's face on Friday evening, when she had said his mother's name. "I need to know which it is," Elizabeth said. "Before anything else, I need to know whether he knew." "And if he did?" Garrett asked carefully. Elizabeth looked at the copy of the filing, at William's signature on a document that had helped fund the theft of his own inheritance. "Then I have a different problem than the one I thought I had," she said. She had not planned to go back to Ashford Manor. Not yet. Not until she had everything organized and verified and properly understood. But the letter from Thomas arrived Monday afternoon, and it changed the arithmetic. 4 words this time, not 3. "She's calling a meeting." Elizabeth read it and was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand. She crossed to the window and stood there for a moment with the note in her hand and worked through what it meant. Victoria was calling a meeting at Ashford Manor, which meant she was gathering people, which meant she was constructing a version of events, her version, her arrangement, her chosen witnesses, before Elizabeth could present any other version. Victoria was building the room. Elizabeth thought about what she had said to Garrett. If she wants to present her evidence somewhere, we should make sure the room is already arranged. She had been right, and she had been faster. "Clara!" Elizabeth called. Clara appeared. She was carrying a book and wearing the expression of a woman who has been expecting to be called. "I need to go back," Elizabeth said. "To the estate." "Not yet. I need to speak with someone first." Elizabeth was already moving, already pulling on her gloves. "Do you know Margaret Beaumont's address in town?" Clara blinked. "Margaret Beaumont, the woman who was standing 3 feet from me when William said what he said on Tuesday night." Elizabeth picked up her bag. The woman who was watching every moment of it with that expression she wears when she knows she has something worth telling. She pulled on the second glove. "I need her." "Margaret Beaumont talks to everyone," Clara said, not quite a warning. "I know," Elizabeth said. "That's why I need her." Margaret Beaumont lived in a well-appointed house on Grace Street and was so thoroughly surprised to find Elizabeth Ashford on her doorstep on a Monday afternoon that she said absolutely nothing for a full 3 seconds, which was by Elizabeth's estimation the longest Margaret Beaumont had ever been silent in her life. "Come in," Margaret said finally. Elizabeth came in. She declined tea. She sat down in the blue parlor with her bag in her lap and looked at Margaret Beaumont, who was looking back at her with eyes that were taking in absolutely everything, and she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen before you say anything." "All right," Margaret said, with the avid attention of a woman who has just been handed the most interesting invitation she has received all year. "On Tuesday night," Elizabeth began, "you watched my husband ask me to apologize to Lady Bellamy. You watched me leave instead. You have spent the time since then forming your own opinion about what happened and why, and I am not here to tell you your opinion is wrong, because I don't know what your opinion is." She paused. "What I am here to tell you is that there is more to what happened in that ballroom than anyone in the room understood. And there is more to what Victoria Bellamy has been doing in this county for the past 4 years than anyone has been paying attention to. And in the next few days, I believe Victoria is going to call together a significant number of people from this community to hear her version of events. And I would like the truth to be in the room as well." Margaret was very quiet. Her eyes were sharp and bright and entirely focused. "What truth?" she asked. "Financial fraud," Elizabeth said. "Systematic misappropriation of the Ashford estate funds over a period of approximately 4 years. The involvement of Percival Coldwell, the Ashford family solicitor, and the very strong possibility that the death of the late Duchess Catherine Ashford was not the accident it appeared to be." The silence that followed was the densest silence Elizabeth had produced in her entire tenure as Duchess of Ashford. Margaret Beaumont leaned forward very slightly in her chair. "Tell me everything," she said. She told her enough. Not everything, she was careful about that. She gave Margaret the shape of the story, The outline of what the documents showed enough to be shocking and enough to be credible. She did not show her the journal. The journal was for William. What she showed Margaret was the property record, the filing, the account discrepancies summarized in the clean, organized form that Garrett had prepared. Margaret looked at all of it with the intense focus of a woman who had been collecting other people's business for 40 years and had just found the largest collection she had ever seen. "This is," Margaret said. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. "Coldwell has been my husband's solicitor for 15 years, Margaret said slowly. Elizabeth had not known that. She filed it away. "I'm sorry to tell you that." Margaret looked up from the documents. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to be in the room," Elizabeth said. "Wherever Victoria is holding her meeting, I want you there. And I want you to bring your husband, and I want you to bring the Reverend if you can, and Judge Hartwell if he's a friend of yours." She held Margaret's gaze. "I want the people who matter in this county to see what I show them, and I want to show it to them before Victoria has finished arranging things to her own satisfaction." "You want to get there first?" Margaret said. "Yes," Elizabeth said simply. Margaret sat back. She looked at the documents again. She looked at Elizabeth. And she did something Elizabeth had not expected. She smiled. Not the performed social smile of the ballroom. Something genuine. Something with an edge in it. "Tuesday night," Margaret said. "I watched you put that ring on the table, and I thought either that woman is completely done, or she's just getting started." She paused. "I think I have my answer. Will you help me?" Elizabeth asked. "My dear," Margaret said, "I have been waiting 20 years for something worth being involved in." What Elizabeth had not accounted for in all her careful planning was William arriving at Clara's house again that evening. This time he didn't knock. Clara let him in before Elizabeth could decide whether she wanted her to, and he came through to the sitting room where Elizabeth was organizing her papers, and he stood in the doorway and said without any preamble at all, "I read the journal." Elizabeth set down her pen. She looked at him. He looked worse than he had on Friday. He looked like a man who had not slept in 2 days and had spent those 2 days rearranging everything he believed about the last 10 years of his life. "Sit down," she said. He sat. This in itself was something. William Ashford did not usually sit when standing was available. "Tell me what you know," he said. "Tell me first," Elizabeth said, "whether you signed a document authorizing the transfer of estate funds into a land management company called Harrow Holdings." He went very still. "Where did you hear that name?" he said. "Did you sign it?" Elizabeth asked. "I signed." He stopped, started again. "Coldwell presented me with several routine documents the month after my mother died. I was—" His jaw tightened. "I was not in the best frame of mind. I signed what he put in front of me. I trusted him. He had served this family for over 20 years. I had no reason to—" He stopped again. "What was in those documents?" "One of them authorized the transfer of approximately $12,000 in land assets into a company controlled by Coldwell," Elizabeth said. "The land should have passed to the estate under your father's will. It didn't." The color left his face. Not the dramatic absence of color you read about in novels. The quiet, real kind where a man's face simply goes a shade closer to gray because his body has received information it doesn't know what to do with. "My mother was right," he said, barely audible. "Yes," Elizabeth said gently. "She was." He sat with that for a moment. She let him. She did not rush him, and she did not comfort him, and she did not fill the silence with anything, because sometimes the most decent thing you can do for someone is let them sit with a hard truth without someone else's words in the way. "How long?" he asked. "The accounts suggest 4 years, she said. "Possibly longer. Garrett is still working through it." "Garrett?" "A solicitor on Canal Street. He's been helping me verify what I found." William looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't quite name. "You've had a solicitor working on this." "Since Thursday." "You found the first letter in October," he said slowly. You've been doing this since October. Yes. Another silence, different quality than the last one. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. Elizabeth looked at him steadily. Because in October, she said, I didn't know whether you were involved. And in November I still didn't know. And by December I had enough to understand that whatever was happening was larger than a single letter, and I needed to understand it fully before I brought it to anyone, including you. She paused. And because in October and November, and every month since, you have not given me any particular reason to believe that what I said to you would be heard. He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it. She watched him for the first time since she had known him actually sit with something uncomfortable instead of moving past it. That's fair, he said finally. She blinked. It was not what she had expected him to say. She began. It's fair, he repeated. He was looking at the table at her papers, at the neat stacks of documents she had spent 7 months collecting. I have not been. He stopped. Tried again. You have been in my house for 11 months, and I have not. Another stop. He was not, she was realizing, a man who had much practice being honest about his own failures. The words were coming out in pieces. I failed to see what was in front of me. On multiple counts. The room was very quiet. Yes, Elizabeth said. You did. She did not say it cruelly. She did not say it to wound him. She said it because it was true, and because she had learned in 11 months of silence that the truth said plainly and without theater was almost always more effective than the truth said with feeling. He nodded slowly. Then, what is Victoria planning? A meeting, Elizabeth said. Somewhere in the county with the people who matter here. I believe she intends to shape the narrative before we can present anything different. She's fast, William said. Not admiringly. Something grimmer than admiration. She always has been, Elizabeth said. But we know what she's doing, which means we're not surprised by it. Which means... She met his gaze. We need to be faster. He looked at her for a long moment. Something was shifting between them. She could feel it, something that had nothing to do with the documents on the table, or the fraud, or Victoria, or any of the practical things they were discussing. Something more fundamental than any of that. The night of the ball, he said. What I asked you to do. Not now, Elizabeth said. Elizabeth, there will be time for that, she said. After. Right now we have 3 days at most before Victoria holds her meeting. I have Garrett's formal account ready to present. I have Margaret Beaumont, who will bring her husband and the Reverend, and I believe Judge Hartwell. I need you to tell me who else matters in this county, and how to reach them by tomorrow morning. He stared at her. She looked back at him, patient and steady, with her pen in her hand, and 7 months of careful work spread on the table between them. You've been running a campaign, he said, not accusing, something closer to wondering. I've been surviving, Elizabeth said, which required becoming organized. A long beat. Then slowly William Ashford reached across the table and pulled one of the document stacks toward him. Judge Hargrove, he said. He owes me a conversation, and Colonel Pierce. He looked at the paper in front of him. And there's a man named Webb at the Virginia Gazette who has been looking for a story about Coldwell for 2 years. Something about an estate dispute in Fredericksburg. He glanced up. Would that be useful? Elizabeth felt something settle into place. Not victory, not yet. Something earlier than victory, the particular sensation of watching the shape of a thing become clear. Yes, she said. That would be useful. They worked until midnight. It was the strangest hours Elizabeth had spent in her marriage, sitting across a table from her husband, who she had lived with for 11 months in near total emotional distance, working through documents together with a focus and efficiency that neither of them had ever managed to bring to the actual business of being married. He was sharp, she discovered. Sharper than she had given him credit for, though in fairness, she had not been given many opportunities to observe him thinking seriously. He caught things she had missed. He understood the land records in a way she didn't knew the geography of the county, knew which properties bordered which, and why the particular parcel Coldwell had registered mattered as much as it did. He also knew things about Coldwell that Elizabeth hadn't known. Small things separately meaningless. The solicitor's relationship with a judge in Fredericksburg, a business interest in a shipping company, a cousin who worked in the county land office. The cousin who worked in the county land office. Elizabeth set down her pen. His cousin, she said, in the land office. William looked up. Harmon. He's been there 4 years. 4 years. The same 4 years as the fraudulent transactions. Could he have altered filings? Elizabeth asked. County records made things appear legitimate that weren't. William went very still. Yes, he said slowly. He could have. Elizabeth thought about the anonymous letter. I think you should look at the Bellamy estate accounts from the year before last. The county records. The ones an insider could reach. She thought about the word altered. Coldwell had asked someone in his office to alter records, and that person had written to her instead. What if there were other records that had already been altered? Altered before anyone started looking by a cousin placed conveniently inside the right office 4 years ago. Garrett needs to know this, she said. Now, William asked. In the morning, Elizabeth said. First thing. He nodded. Then he looked at her with something she didn't have a name for. Not quite guilt, not quite wonder, something in between them. Elizabeth, he said. Not yet, she said again. I was going to say, he paused. You should know that I was not. I want you to know that what happened Tuesday night was not. He stopped, tried again, and she could see the effort it cost him, this man, who had never in his life had to find words for his mistakes. I don't believe Victoria's account of events. I don't think I believed it that night either. He set down his pen. I think I took the easier choice. The room was very still. I know, Elizabeth said. That's not an excuse, he said. No. She agreed. It isn't. He nodded. He didn't ask for forgiveness. She appreciated that more than she expected to. She had been prepared for apologies, and apologies would have required a response she wasn't ready to give. This was just honesty. Plain and uncomfortable, and offered without expectation. She picked up her pen. The Hargrove dinner is Wednesday, she said. Margaret Beaumont will make sure the right people are there. I need you to speak with Judge Hargrove directly and ensure he attends. I can do that, William said. Good. She looked at the documents. Then we should sleep. There's a great deal to do tomorrow. He stood. She did not look up. He walked to the doorway and stopped. The ring, he said. She looked up then. It's on the table at the estate, he said. Where you left it. I didn't move it. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. He left. Elizabeth sat in the quiet of Clara's sitting room lamp, burning low papers stacked in their careful order. She looked at her left hand, bare and light and entirely her own. She thought about what he'd said. I took the easier choice. She thought about Catherine Ashford writing in her journal by candlelight, afraid and unheard and correct about everything. She thought about what Wednesday would bring. She picked up her pen one more time and wrote at the bottom of the last page, Harmon, County Land Office, 4 years, underlined it. Then she set the pen down. She was almost ready, almost. But somewhere across the county in a candlelit room at Ashford Manor, Victoria Bellamy was also not sleeping. And Victoria had never in her life waited to be almost ready. She had always simply moved. Tuesday came in fast and mean. Elizabeth was awake before dawn, sitting at Clara's table with coffee. She wasn't tasting going through the documents one final time. Not because she didn't know them. She knew them the way she knew her own handwriting, every figure, every date, every name. She was going through them because there was a particular discipline in reviewing what you know before you walk into a room where knowing it will matter. Her father had never understood that discipline. He had always believed that being right was enough. Elizabeth had learned in 11 months of being right and unheard that being right was only the beginning. Garrett arrived at 7. He came through Clara's back door, with his coat still buttoned wrong and his spectacles already on, which meant he had left his house in a hurry, which meant something had happened. "Harmon," he said before he'd fully cleared the doorway. Elizabeth set down her coffee. "What about him? He resigned from the county land office yesterday afternoon." Garrett came to the table and set his bag down and opened it with hands that were steadier than his face. Effective immediately. No notice. Collected his things and left. Elizabeth felt the shift. Not panic. The specific alertness of someone who has been expecting a move and has just heard it happen. "Victoria knows we found the connection." "Or Coldwell told him to disappear," Garrett said. "Either way, he's gone. Which means if there were altered records, the man who altered them is no longer accessible." He pulled out a sheet of paper. However, he set it on the table with the precision of a man presenting something he is proud of. Before he left, he filed a document, a correction, to a land record from 3 years ago. Elizabeth leaned forward. A correction, replacing his signature with the original document's proper witness. Garrett looked at her over his spectacles. He corrected his own fraud, voluntarily, before he ran. Elizabeth stared at the correction document. The legal implications settled into her like cold water. Why would he do that? "I believe," Garrett said carefully, "that your anonymous letter writer may have had a conversation with Harmon before writing to you, a persuasive conversation, about what happens to men who falsify county records when someone with legal standing begins asking questions about those records. Someone had moved on her behalf. Someone she had never met, had never spoken to, had only received 3 careful sentences from, had gone to Harmon and applied exactly the right pressure at exactly the right moment." "The correction makes the fraud provable," Elizabeth said. "Irrefutably," Garrett said. "You no longer need Harmon's testimony. The corrected record itself is the evidence." Elizabeth sat back. She breathed. And then she said, "We need William here. Now." Yet, he arrived within the hour. He had clearly not slept either. He came through Clara's front door with the particular energy of a man who has been thinking hard all night and has arrived at conclusions he is not entirely comfortable with, and is going to act on them anyway. He sat down, looked at the correction document Garrett placed in front of him, and was quiet for a long moment. "Harmon did this," he said. "Yesterday afternoon," Garrett confirmed. William set the document down. He pressed his fingers flat against the table, a gesture Elizabeth had seen him make when he was organizing something internally. Some difficult rearrangement of what he believed and what he now knew. "Coldwell served my family for 22 years, he said. "Not defending, working through it." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "My father trusted him completely." "Your mother stopped trusting him about 4 years ago," Elizabeth said. "She wrote about it." He nodded, the slow nod of a man absorbing something that hurts. "The meeting Victoria is calling," he said. "When?" "Wednesday evening," Elizabeth said. "Margaret Beaumont confirmed it last night. Victoria has invited the Hargroves, the Hartwell family, Reverend Caldwell, and Colonel Pierce. She's framed it as," Elizabeth paused, "as a gathering to discuss recent events and restore social order." William made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "She's framing it as a community concern. She's framing you as a wronged party and me as a disruptive influence," Elizabeth said. "She intends to establish that my departure from the estate was an act of instability, that the accusations I'm believed to be making are without foundation, and that the appropriate course of action is for me to be," she chose the word carefully, "managed." The word sat on the table between them like something that needed to be looked at directly. "Managed," William repeated. "It's what she said to Margaret Beaumont," Elizabeth said. "Margaret told me this morning." William's jaw tightened. Elizabeth watched it. He was angry, she realized, not the performed cold anger he used as a social instrument, but something genuine, something that came from a different place. Something personal. "She's been doing this for years," he said. "Arranging things, making sure the room is set before anyone else arrives. He looked at Elizabeth. I watched her do it. I thought... He stopped. You thought she was managing things on your behalf, Elizabeth said. Yes. His voice was flat. I was wrong. You were, she agreed. And then, because it was also true, you were also grieving, and she was very good at being what you needed. He looked at her. Something shifted in his eyes. Not gratitude, exactly. Something quieter than that. You're being generous, he said. I'm being accurate, Elizabeth said. There's a difference. She pulled the documents into order. We need to be at the Hargrove house before Victoria gets there Wednesday evening. Or we need to change the venue entirely and ensure the right people are gathered somewhere else first. Garrett, William said, what do we need for this to hold up legally, if it comes to that? Garrett had been quietly organizing his own papers and now looked up with the expression of a man who has been waiting to be asked exactly this question. The correction document, the original accounts showing the diversions, the letters between Victoria and Coldwell, and the property registration, those four together establish a case that Coldwell, with Bellamy's participation, systematically defrauded the Ashford estate. The journal is supporting evidence for the pattern of behavior, though it would not stand alone. He paused. For a civil claim that is sufficient. For anything further, he paused again. That would depend on what the county magistrate is willing to hear. Hargrove, Williams said. Judge Hargrove is the right man. He and Coldwell have never been on easy terms. Then we need Hargrove at our meeting before he's at Victoria's, Elizabeth said. William was already standing. I'll go see him this morning. Take Garrett, Elizabeth said. Take the documents. Don't tell him everything yet. Tell him enough that he understands the nature of what's happened and agrees to hear a full account. William looked at her. She looked back at him, steady and clear, in the way she had looked at things her entire life. You're better at this than I am, he said, not resentfully, with the particular tone of a man making an honest observation about something that surprises him. I've had more practice being careful, Elizabeth said. It's what happens when no one is listening to you. She picked up her pen. Go. You have 3 hours before noon. He went. It ended. He came back at 11:30 with Garrett behind him and an expression that meant something had happened, though she couldn't tell yet what kind of something. Hargrove agreed to hear the evidence, he said, sitting down. He'll come to the estate tomorrow evening, before Victoria's gathering. He paused. He also told me something. Elizabeth looked up. Coldwell filed a writ this morning, William said, against the estate. He's claiming the Duke of Ashford owes him 6 years of back payment for legal services rendered in the amount of... He glanced at Garrett. $8,000, Garrett said. The room went still. Elizabeth set down her pen. She understood what this was immediately. It was not a claim Coldwell expected to win. It was a move. The move of a man who knows he is about to be exposed and is trying to create noise to muddy the water, to give himself leverage, or at minimum, a distraction, while he arranged his exit. He knows, Elizabeth said. He knows, William confirmed, or he suspects enough to move. Harmon ran, Elizabeth said, and then Coldwell filed a writ by morning. That's not coincidence. Harmon told him someone was looking. Which means he's planning to leave, William said. Or he's planning to discredit you before he does, Garrett said quietly. A writ against the estate filed before any counter-allegations are formalized places you in a defensive position. It makes the Duke appear to be the party with financial disputes rather than the party who has been robbed, William said. Yes. Elizabeth looked at the documents on the table. Everything she had. Everything she and Garrett and William had assembled over the past 4 days. She measured it against a writ filed by a man with 22 years of access to this family's affairs. A man who knew the county's legal machinery the way she knew the rooms of Ashford Manor. How fast can we respond to the writ? She asked Garrett. A counterfiling can be prepared today, Garrett said. I would need the Duke's formal authorization and signature. You have it. William said without hesitation. Garrett nodded and reached for his pen. "And the meeting tomorrow," Elizabeth said. "We move it up. We don't wait for the evening. We get Hargrove to the estate by 4 o'clock, and we show him everything before dinner." "I'll send word this afternoon," William said. "There's one more thing," Elizabeth said. She looked at both of them. "I need to speak to Victoria." Both men looked at her. "Directly," she said. "Before tomorrow. Not to warn her. Not to give her an opportunity to prepare." She kept her voice level. "I need to look her in the eye, and I need to give her one opportunity to tell the truth herself, because if she does—" She paused. "It will be easier for everyone, and if she doesn't, I need to have seen her face when she chose not to." William was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "Because I have been watching this woman for 11 months, Elizabeth said. "And I want to understand what she actually is, not what she performs, not what she's constructed for other people to see." She looked at him. "I want to see what she does when she knows the walls are coming in." William held her gaze for a long moment. "She won't tell the truth," he said. "I know," Elizabeth said, "but I'll know something true about her from watching her refuse to." She went to Ashford Manor that afternoon. It was the first time she had been there since Tuesday night. Thomas met her at the door before she'd fully descended from the carriage, and in his face she saw relief, and something older than relief, the particular expression of a loyal man who has been holding things together in a difficult house and is deeply grateful for the return of the person he holds things together for. "Your Grace," he said. "Thomas." She looked at him. "Is she here?" "In the east sitting room, ma'am. She arrived this morning and has not left." Elizabeth nodded. She did not ask how Lady Bellamy had come to be occupying a room in Ashford Manor without the Duke present. She already knew the answer. Victoria had been here so long, moved through this house so completely, that the boundaries between guest and resident had dissolved years ago without anyone formally discussing them. That was in its way the whole story. She walked through this house that she had lived in for 11 months and felt the particular strangeness of a place that was both familiar and foreign. The floors she had walked every day, the walls she had learned the art of the rooms she had managed and organized and kept running, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been trained to make herself useful and been trained well. She had cared for this house. She had learned it thoroughly. She had found its secrets inside it and carried them out of it, and was now walking back into it with those secrets organized and prepared and ready. She knocked on the east sitting room door. A pause, deliberate. "Come in," Victoria said. She was sitting in the chair by the window, and she looked. Elizabeth gave her that entirely composed, not the stiff composure of someone caught off guard, the settled composure of someone who had been expecting this. That was its own kind of information. "Elizabeth," Victoria said. No title, as in the ballroom. "Lady Bellamy," Elizabeth said, and sat down in the chair across from her. She did not set her bag down. She kept it in her lap. Victoria looked at her with those calibrated green eyes. "I didn't expect to see you back so soon." "I imagine not," Elizabeth said. "I wanted to speak with you before tomorrow." "What happens tomorrow?" Victoria asked. The question was smooth. Too smooth, she already knew. "Judge Hargrove is coming to hear evidence," Elizabeth said, "about the Ashford estate accounts, about Coldwell, about certain land transactions from the past 4 years." She watched Victoria's face. "I wanted you to know in advance." A beat of silence, very small, but there. "That's very considerate," Victoria said. "I'm not doing it to be considerate," Elizabeth said. "I'm doing it because I want to give you the opportunity to come forward yourself, before the evidence does it for you." Victoria smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind she had been deploying in Virginia's social circles for years, the kind that looked like warmth and was made entirely of calculation. "You have a high opinion of your evidence," she said. "I have an accurate opinion of it," Elizabeth said. "Letters," Victoria said. "Old accounts. A dead woman's diary." She tilted her head. Do you know how many times a grieving family has misread financial documents and turned it into a story about betrayal? It is far more common than you might think. Harmon's correction changes that, Elizabeth said. The altered county records aren't misread documents, they're fraud, and they're now corrected in the public record with a paper trail that leads directly back to Coldwell. Something crossed Victoria's face. The smallest thing, gone before it fully arrived. But Elizabeth had been watching, and she caught it. The moment Victoria had not known about Harmon's correction. So Harmon ran, Victoria said, still smooth, recovering fast. Yes, Elizabeth said. Men like Harmon always run, Victoria said. They're not built for pressure. No? Elizabeth agreed. But the correction he filed is built to last. She looked at Victoria steadily. You are very good at what you do. I want you to know that I understand how good you are. I understand how long you've been doing this and how carefully you've done it. And I am telling you directly that the evidence assembled against you and against Coldwell is sufficient, and that what happens tomorrow is going to be public, and it is going to be on the record, and it cannot be shaped or arranged or managed after the fact. She paused. I am giving you the chance to get ahead of it. The room was very quiet. Victoria looked at her for a long time. Elizabeth did not look away. You came here to offer me a way out, Victoria said slowly. I came here to give you one opportunity to tell the truth, Elizabeth corrected. There is a difference. Victoria leaned back slightly in her chair. The practiced smile had faded. What was under it was harder and older and more real. And if I told the truth, she said, what would that look like? Exactly. You would speak to Judge Hargrove tomorrow, Elizabeth said. You would give a full account. Coldwell's role, your role, the arrangements made, the money moved. You would cooperate fully. And in return, I can't promise you anything, Elizabeth said. I'm not in a position to make that arrangement. What I can tell you is that a woman who cooperates voluntarily is in a substantially different position than a woman who is exposed by documents and forced records. She held Victoria's gaze. You know that. A long silence. Victoria looked at her. Really looked at her. Not the assessing look she had used in ballrooms. Not the calculated gaze she had applied to every interaction Elizabeth had ever observed. Something more direct. Something that acknowledged for the first time that the woman across from her was not what she had been classified as. You're not what I expected, Victoria said. No, Elizabeth said. I don't imagine I am. Another silence. I need time to think, Victoria said. You have tonight, Elizabeth said. She stood. She picked up her bag. She moved to the door, and then she turned one last time, because she was not a woman who said things she didn't mean, and there was one thing left to say. Lady Bellamy, I know you loved him. I don't mean that as an accusation. I think you loved him in whatever way you are able to love things, and I think the rest of what you did grew around that, the way weeds grow around something real. I'm not here because I hate you. She paused. I'm here because what you did to his mother was not love, and what you took from this family was not yours to take. She left before Victoria could respond. Thomas was waiting in the corridor. Walk with me, Elizabeth said quietly, and he fell into step beside her with the silent efficiency of 20 years of practice. She said nothing until they were in the main corridor far enough from the east sitting room to speak without risk. Where is the ring? She asked. On the table in the entrance hall, Your Grace, Thomas said. Where you left it. She nodded. Leave it there for now. Thomas said nothing, but she felt his attention steady and careful in the way of a man who understood more than he was required to say. Thomas, she said. The staff, are they all right? He was quiet for a beat, the beat of a man choosing honesty over comfort. They're unsettled, ma'am. Not unhappy exactly. Unsettled. He paused. Mrs. Doyle has been keeping things running. The younger ones are following her lead. Tell Mrs. Doyle I appreciate it. Elizabeth stopped at the front door. And tell her that things are going to change after tomorrow. Not in the way Lady Bellamy intends them to change. Thomas looked at her. In his eyes, she saw the particular expression of a man who has served a household through difficult things and has learned over years of careful observation to read the difference between empty assurance and genuine preparation. He saw it. She knew he saw it. "Yes, Your Grace," he said, and opened the door. The drive back to Clara's house was the longest 20 minutes Elizabeth had spent all week, and that was saying something. She sat in the carriage and let herself feel what she hadn't been letting herself feel. Not the strategy, not the evidence, not the next move. The other thing, the thing that had been living underneath all the work, like water under rock. She thought about Victoria's face when she said, "I know you loved him." She thought about the particular truth of that and what it cost her to say it, and why she had said it anyway. Because it was true. Because understanding why someone did something wasn't the same as excusing it, and she had been raised to know the difference, even though her father had often confused the two. She thought about William saying, "I took the easier choice," and the way it had sounded not like a performance of contrition, but like a man making an accurate assessment of his own behavior. She had not forgiven him. She had not decided whether she would, but she had noticed it. She was making a note of it the way she made notes of everything. She thought about Catherine Ashford writing by candlelight. "I am afraid for whoever comes after me." She thought about the ring on the table in the entrance hall. She thought about what she was walking toward. The carriage stopped. Clara was at the door before Elizabeth reached it, which meant Margaret Beaumont had sent word, which meant something else had happened. "What?" Elizabeth said. "A letter from Victoria," Clara said. "Delivered an hour ago." Elizabeth took it. She stood right there on Clara's doorstep and broke the seal and read. It was 2 sentences. "I will speak to Judge Hargrove tomorrow. I will tell him the truth about my arrangement with Coldwell." That was all. No signature. No elaboration. Elizabeth read it twice. She stood with it for a moment in the summer heat, the paper warm in her hand. She thought about what it meant. Not for the legal case, for the case it changed nothing. They had enough without Victoria's cooperation. But for something else. Something harder to name. That a woman who had built her entire existence on arrangement and calculation had at the last moment chosen to do the one thing she had never been required to do. She had told the truth before she was forced to. "Well," Clara said. "She's going to cooperate," Elizabeth said. Clara blinked. "Truly, yes." Elizabeth folded the letter and put it in her bag with everything else. "I think she was tired," she said. "I think she has been performing for so long that when someone finally sat down across from her and spoke to her directly, she didn't know what to do except respond in kind." She went inside. There was still work to do. So, Hargrove arrived at 4 o'clock the next day. He was a large man, deliberate in his movements, with the manner of a judge who has spent 30 years listening to people tell him things, and has developed the ability to hear what is actually being said underneath what is being spoken. He came with his clerk, a young man named Powell, who wrote quickly and without expression. He sat at the main table in the Ashford Library and he listened. William presented first. He was straightforward and precise, in a way that surprised Elizabeth. She had not expected him to be so organized, and then she remembered that he had been awake until midnight the night before reading through documents with her, and she realized that the preparation had been mutual in ways she hadn't fully credited. Then, Garrett presented the account documents and the property records, and the correction with the clean, careful logic of a man who has assembled evidence for examination and knows its strengths and its limits. Then Elizabeth spoke. She placed the letters on the table. She placed the accounts. She placed the correction document. She placed Catherine's journal last, and she placed it with care, the care you give to something that costs someone their life to write. Hargrove read in silence. His clerk wrote in silence. The room was very quiet except for the sound of paper turning and the occasional scratch of Powell's pen. When he was finished, Hargrove set down the last document, the journal, with the deliberate gentleness of a man who understands what he is handling. He looked at Elizabeth. "You compiled this yourself?" he asked. "With Mr. Garrett's assistance," she said. "Over several months." "While residing in the estate?" "Yes." He looked at William. "You were unaware of this investigation?" "Until 5 days ago," William said. "Yes." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned that rushing to conclusion is the enemy of accuracy. "Lady Bellamy," he said, "I understand she is present." "She indicated this morning that she intends to speak with you," Elizabeth said. Hargrove nodded slowly. He looked at the journal one more time, his large hand resting beside it without touching it. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, and then he corrected himself, "Your Grace." He looked at her steadily. "In 30 years on the bench, I have heard a great many accounts of fraud and deception. I have heard very few presented with this degree of organization and precision." He paused. "I want you to know that I intend to take this seriously." Elizabeth held his gaze. "Thank you," she said. She meant it. Victoria came in 20 minutes later. She had dressed carefully, which was not surprising. She had the composed bearing of someone who has made a decision and is holding to it with both hands, which Elizabeth recognized from the inside, having made several decisions herself this week that required the same kind of holding. She sat across from Hargrove without looking at William or Elizabeth. She folded her hands on the table. She took a breath, and she began to speak. She spoke for 40 minutes. She told Hargrove about the arrangement with Coldwell. She told him about the land transactions, the redirected funds, the 4 years of careful and systematic diversion. She told him about Harmon and the altered records and the company that Coldwell had established to receive and legitimize the money. Her voice was steady throughout. It was not the voice of a woman in remorse. It was the voice of a woman who has made a calculation and is executing it with the same precision she has brought to every other calculation in her life. She did not at any point look at Elizabeth. But when she reached the end, when she had finished, when Hargrove's clerk had stopped writing, and the room had gone into the particular quiet that follows the completion of something large, she looked up. And she looked at Elizabeth. It was not an apology. Elizabeth had not expected one and did not need one. It was something simpler and stranger than that. It was recognition. The specific acknowledgement that passes between two people when one of them sees for the first time that the other was not what they were categorized as. Elizabeth held her gaze for one moment. Then she looked at Hargrove. "What happens next?" she asked. "Coldwell will be summoned," Hargrove said. He was already organizing the documents in front of him with the methodical care of a man who has shifted into a different mode of operation. "The county magistrate will be informed. The writ Coldwell filed against the estate will be suspended pending investigation." He looked at William. "The land will need to be properly adjudicated, which will take some time. But I see no reason why the estate cannot be considered the rightful party from this point forward." He looked at the correction document. "Harmon's filing helps considerably." William nodded. Hargrove stood. He extended his hand to Elizabeth first, which she noticed, and which she suspected he intended her to notice. "Your Grace," he said, "this was well done." She shook his hand. After Hargrove left, after his clerk left, after Victoria had been escorted out by Thomas, with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that something significant had concluded and that his job was to manage the ending with dignity, the library was still. Elizabeth and William were alone for the first time since Tuesday night in a room that wasn't Clara's sitting room or a solicitor's office. A room in their own house. A room with Catherine's journal on the table between them. "It's over," William said. "The legal part," Elizabeth said. "Yes, mostly." He looked at her. She looked back at him. Outside, the Virginia summer pressed its heat against the windows, and somewhere in the house Mrs. Doyle was giving instructions to the kitchen, and Thomas was seeing to something in the entrance hall, and the world of Ashford Manor was going on around them exactly as it always had, except that everything inside it had changed. "Elizabeth," William said. And this time she didn't say, "Not yet." She waited. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "What you want. What this is supposed to look like. I don't know how to—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I have not been a good husband." "No," she said. "I don't know if I know how to be," he said. "That's the honest answer. I don't know if it's in me." She looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know either," she said. He looked up. "But I know this," she said. "You read the documents with me until midnight. You went to Hargrove without being asked twice. You sat in this room this afternoon and told the truth about what you signed, and what you didn't know, and what you should have seen and didn't." She paused. "Those are not the actions of a man who doesn't know how." He was very still. "They are," she said, "the actions of a man who is learning." A long, quiet beat, and then from the entrance hall they both heard it, the small, distinct sound of Thomas setting something on a table, the ring. Still there, still where she had left it. Elizabeth looked at the doorway. She did not pick it up. Not today. There were things that needed to happen before that, conversations that needed to be had, ground that needed to be walked across carefully and honestly before anyone arrived anywhere. She knew that. She was a woman who believed in doing things correctly in the right order with the right preparation. But she stood. She walked to the doorway, and she looked at the ring on the table in the entrance hall of the house that was hers, that she had kept and learned and searched and fought for. And she thought about the woman who had feared for whoever came after her, and she thought, "I'm here. I'm standing. I found it." Behind her she heard William get up from his chair. She heard him cross the room. He stopped beside her. They stood together in the doorway and looked at the entrance hall, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said right now that couldn't be said better later, when the ground was more solid, when the work was more done. "Dinner," Elizabeth said finally. "Mrs. Doyle will have something prepared." "Yes," William said. They walked toward the dining room together, not touching, not close exactly, but side by side, which was more than they had managed in 11 months, and which was, for now, enough. The dinner that evening was the strangest meal Elizabeth had ever eaten, not because anything dramatic happened. Precisely the opposite. Mrs. Doyle had set two places at the long dining table, not at opposite ends, the way Elizabeth and William had eaten for 11 months, but closer together at one end, which was either an assumption or a decision. And either way, Elizabeth suspected Thomas had something to do with it. The food was good. The candles burned steady. Outside, the Virginia summer evening settled into the particular blue dark of late July, and the crickets started up the way they always did, and the house was quiet in a way it had not been quiet in a very long time. William passed her the bread without being asked, because she had reached for it at the same moment, and his hand was closer. It was such a small thing. She almost didn't know what to do with it. They ate mostly in silence, but it was a different silence than the silences of the past 11 months. Those had been silences of absence, the particular emptiness of two people in the same room who have decided consciously or not to be somewhere else. This was something different. This was the silence of two people who have been through something difficult together and are sitting with the aftermath of it, neither of them certain what comes next, both of them too tired for pretense. "Garrett will have the formal response to Coldwell's writ filed by morning," William said. "Good," Elizabeth said. "Hargrove said 2 weeks before the magistrate formally opens the investigation." "That's faster than I expected." "Hargrove is thorough," William said. "When he decides to move, he moves." She nodded. She ate. She thought about 2 weeks and what 2 weeks meant for this house, and the people in it, and the shape of what came after. "The staff," she said. "They'll need to know something, not everything, but enough to understand that the situation has stabilized." "I'll speak to them tomorrow morning," William said. She looked at him. "We should speak to them together." A pause. He looked up from his plate. "Together," he said. "They have been working in an unstable house for months," Elizabeth said. "Mrs. Doyle especially. They deserve to hear from both of us that it's settled." She held his gaze. "Together means something different than separately. They'll understand the difference." He was quiet for a moment, not resisting, considering. "All right," he said. "Together." She looked back at her plate. Something small and careful loosened in her chest, not much, but something. They finished dinner.
Now it's here.
She did not sleep in the blue bedroom that night. Not in William's chambers either. That was not where they were, and she was not a woman who moved faster than the ground beneath her could hold. But she did not go back to the far end of the corridor to the room where she had cried and then stopped crying and then started watching. She asked Mrs. Doyle to open the rooms that had been Catherine's, and she slept there in the late Duchess's bed in the room where Catherine had written her fears into a journal and hoped someone would find them. Elizabeth found them. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her. The old wood sounds, the summer air moving through the gaps, the distant night bird outside, and she thought about what it meant to be in this room. Not haunted by it, steadied by it. Catherine Ashford had been afraid and unseen and ultimately vindicated by a woman she had never met, and there was something in that Elizabeth could not name, but could feel like a hand placed briefly on her shoulder in a dark room. She slept better than she had in a week. In the morning she dressed carefully. Not the ivory silk that was Tuesday night. That was another version of this story. She dressed in dark blue, clean and simple, the dress she wore when she meant to work. Because there was still work to do, and she knew it, and she had never been the kind of woman who believed that the crisis ending meant the work was finished. William was already downstairs when she came down, which surprised her. He was at the breakfast table with a cup of coffee and a document from Garrett that had arrived with the Morning Post, and he looked up when she came in and said, "Good morning," in the same flat tone he had used every morning for 11 months, except that this morning there was something under it she hadn't heard before. Not warmth exactly. Attention. The specific quality of someone who has decided to pay attention. "Good morning," she said, and sat down and poured her own coffee. He slid Garrett's document across the table. "He's added a clause about the land assessment. I think it's right, but you should read it." She read it. It was right. "It's right," she said. He nodded. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. And then Thomas appeared in the doorway and said quietly, "The staff is assembled in the main hall when you're ready, Your Grace." "Your Graces." Elizabeth looked at William. He looked at her. They both stood. There were 14 of them, Mrs. Doyle Thomas, the junior footman, including James, the kitchen staff, the housemaids. They stood in the main hall with the particular posture of people who are trying to look composed, and are not entirely succeeding because the past week had been what it had been, and they were human, and they had been living inside it. Elizabeth stood at the front. William stood beside her. Not half a step behind her, the way a man manages a scene. Beside her. "I want to speak plainly," Elizabeth said. She kept her voice clear, and even the way she had kept it in the ballroom a week ago, except that now it cost her less effort. "This past week has been difficult for this household. You have been working in a situation that was unclear and unsettled, and I know that is not easy. I want you to know that the matter has been addressed. There will be a formal investigation into activities involving the estate's finances, and that investigation will proceed without any requirement for your involvement, unless you are directly contacted by Judge Hargrove's office." She looked around the room, made sure she met each face for a moment. "What matters for you right now is that this household is stable. It is going to remain stable, and your work here has not gone unnoticed." She paused. "Mrs. Doyle," she said. Mrs. Doyle straightened almost imperceptibly. "Your Grace." "You held this house together while I was away," Elizabeth said. "That was not in your job, and it was not expected, and you did it anyway. Thank you." Mrs. Doyle's composure held but just barely. "It's what needed doing, ma'am," she said. "It was," Elizabeth agreed. "And it will be remembered." William spoke then. It was brief 3 sentences about the estate's continuity, the legal process, the assurance of their positions. He spoke without the performative authority she had watched him use in social situations, the voice that announced its own importance. He spoke like a man talking to people whose opinion of him mattered. It was different from anything she had heard from him in 11 months, and she filed it carefully alongside everything else she was learning about who he might be. James, the junior footman, raised his hand. Elizabeth looked at him. "Will Lady Bellamy be returning to the estate, ma'am?" he asked with the direct forthrightness of someone too young to know he was supposed to approach the question more obliquely. "No," Elizabeth said simply. "She will not." James nodded with a satisfaction he did not try to hide. Around the room, several other faces registered the same feeling with varying degrees of discretion. Thomas at the back permitted himself a very small smile. Three days passed. They were not easy days, and they were not simple days, but they were working days, and Elizabeth had always done better with work than with waiting. Garrett filed the formal counter to Coldwell's writ, and the writ was suspended by the end of the week, exactly as Hargrove had said. The magistrate's office sent word that the formal investigation would open the following Monday. Coldwell. Elizabeth heard, through Garrett, had engaged a lawyer from Fredericksburg, which meant he intended to fight, which was his right, and which was also, in Elizabeth's assessment, the act of a man who hadn't yet fully understood the quality of the evidence against him. She felt thinking about that neither satisfaction nor pity. Only the particular clarity of knowing that something set in motion will reach its conclusion, and that her part in setting it in motion was finished. The county talked. Of course it talked. Margaret Beaumont had not become the most informed woman in Virginia by keeping things to herself, and while Elizabeth trusted Margaret to present the facts accurately, because accurate facts were exactly the kind of thing Margaret Beaumont cherished, she had no illusions about the breadth of the conversation that was spreading through Richmond and beyond. On Friday, Governor Randolph's wife sent a card. It said in neat handwriting, "My dear Duchess, I hope you are well. We should call on you next week if convenient." Elizabeth showed it to Clara, who raised both eyebrows. "Governor Randolph's wife does not make calls," Clara said. "She receives them." "I know," Elizabeth said. "What does that mean?" Clara asked. "It means," Elizabeth said, "that the room has changed." She was back at the estate full-time by Thursday. She had her books, her papers, her correspondence, all the administrative machinery of a large household that she had been managing since she arrived, and had managed competently, and had received no acknowledgement for, and was now managing with the additional knowledge that she understood the estate's finances down to the last dollar, which gave her a clarity of authority she had not had before. William watched her work. She noticed him doing it. Not intrusively. The way someone watches something they are trying to understand, the specific attention of a man discovering that what he thought was furniture is in fact architecture. On Thursday evening, he came into the study where she was working and sat down across from her without asking if she minded, which she noted, and said, "The Hargrove dinner. The one that was supposed to happen before all of this. It's been rescheduled for next month. Hargrove wants us both there." "Both of us," Elizabeth said. "Both of us," William confirmed. "Together, formally." He paused. "As the Duke and Duchess of Ashford." She looked up from her papers. "Is that what we are?" she asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. He looked at her for a long moment. "I'd like it to be," he said, "if you're willing to determine what that means. From the beginning, properly." She put down her pen. "What does properly look like to you?" "Honestly, I don't know," he said. "I know what it hasn't looked like. I know what I've done wrong, not everything yet, but I'm learning the list." He held her gaze. "I know that you are more capable than I gave you credit for, and more patient than you should have had to be, and that I spent 11 months looking past you, and I cannot afford to do that again." He paused. "I know that I'd like to stop looking past you." The room was very still. Elizabeth looked at him. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at everything carefully, honestly, without the filter of what she hoped to see. What she saw was a man who was not performing, who was sitting across from her with the slightly uncomfortable posture of someone who has said something true and is now waiting to find out what it costs. I will not pretend the last 11 months didn't happen, she said. I'm not asking you to, and I will not return to being invisible in my own house. I would not ask that either, he said. Not anymore. And if we disagree, she said. Then we disagree as equals, he said. And we say so, to each other, directly. He paused. I have not been good at that. I intend to be better. She looked at him for another long moment. All right, she said. He blinked, as though he had expected more negotiation. All right, he said. I'm not a woman who needs to say something 3 times when once will do, she said. All right, we begin again, properly, from here. Something in his face shifted. Not dramatic. The quiet shift of something that has been held very tightly, being allowed to release just slightly. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet, she said, and picked up her pen. You haven't seen how I run the household accounts. A beat. And then for the first time in 11 months of marriage, William Ashford laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of him, unguarded, nothing like the performed social laughter she had heard from him in ballrooms. It lasted only a moment, but it was genuine, and in its genuineness, it told her more about who he was than anything he had said all week. She didn't smile. But she wanted to. The twist came on Saturday morning. She had not expected it. That was the honest truth after everything she had organized and prepared and anticipated. The thing she had not seen coming arrived the way the most significant things tend to arrive quietly in an ordinary moment. She was in the entrance hall. She had come down to speak to Thomas about the week's arrangements. She was passing the small table where the ring had sat for 10 days, and without having decided to, she stopped. She stood and looked at it. The Ashford family ring. Gold and emerald, too formal a symbol of an institution more than a feeling placed on her finger by a man who had not meant it the way it was supposed to mean something. She had taken it off in front of 30 people as the only declaration available to her in that moment. She had left it on this table and walked out and had not touched it since. She picked it up. It was lighter than she remembered. Or her hand was different now. One or the other. She held it in her palm and looked at it, and she thought about what it would mean to put it back on. Not what it had meant, what it could mean now. Whether those were different things or the same thing, and whether she was the kind of woman who could hold that distinction clearly. She was. She had always been. The question was whether what it could mean was worth the risk of what it had been. She was still standing there when she heard him on the stairs. William came down and saw her standing at the table with the ring in her hand, and he stopped. He stood on the bottom step, and he did not say anything, because he was learning slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely learning when to be quiet. She looked at him. He looked at her. She held the ring between her fingers, and she made a decision. The way she made all her decisions, clearly, honestly, with full awareness of what she was choosing and what she was choosing to leave behind. She did not put it on her left hand. She put it in her pocket. Not yet, she said. But I'm keeping it. He exhaled. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated than relief. Something that had lived at the corner of relief and understanding. All right, he said. When it means what it should mean, she said, you can ask me again. He came down the last step. He stood in front of her. He was close enough that she could see the particular expression he wore when he was not managing his face for an audience, open, complicated, uncertain in a way he was no longer trying to hide. What does it need to mean? He asked. She thought about it honestly. That I am here because I choose to be, she said. Not because a contract says I am. Not because it's convenient or expected, or because the county expects the Duke and Duchess of Ashford to be a unit. Because I choose this. Because you have chosen this. Because we both choose it every day, knowing the other one is choosing it too. She paused. That's what it needs to mean. He nodded slowly. That will take time. Yes, she said. It will. I'm not good at time, he said. At patience. At I know, she said. You're better at it than you were a week ago. He looked at her. A week is not very long. No, she agreed. But it's a start. 4 weeks later, Coldwell entered a settlement with the county magistrate. The terms required him to return the diverted funds. Not all of them could be recovered. Some had moved too far and too fast, through too many intermediary hands, but enough. Enough that the Ashford estate was restored to solvency, and then some. Enough that the land 20 miles south came back under the estate's control through Hargrove's formal adjudication, which went exactly as Garrett had projected it would. Harmon was censured by the county and lost his position, though he had already removed himself from it, which the magistrate noted in his summary, with the dry observation that voluntary departure ahead of consequence does not constitute the same thing as innocence. Victoria Bellamy left Virginia. She went to Charleston. Elizabeth heard through Margaret Beaumont, which heard it from someone else, and would from there likely go elsewhere because that was the thing about Victoria. She was not a woman who stayed anywhere that had stopped being useful to her. Elizabeth thought about her sometimes, not with anger, with the particular sober recognition of a person who has encountered a very capable human being who aimed all of that capability in directions that cost everyone around her everything it cost them. She hoped Victoria would find somewhere a way to use what she had that didn't require taking what belonged to others. She did not expect it, but she hoped. Margaret Beaumont received Elizabeth at her house on Gray Street in late August and served good tea and looked across her parlor with those sharp eyes and said, "You know you're the talk of 4 counties." "I know," Elizabeth said. "They're calling you formidable," Margaret said with the tone of a woman delivering a compliment in the shape of a report. "Are they?" Elizabeth said. "Some of them are saying other things," Margaret said. "But those people are saying them quietly, which means they know they're wrong." She sipped her tea. "The governor's wife is very taken with you." "She's been gracious," Elizabeth said. "She's been strategic," Margaret said dryly. "But in your case, those two things align, which is the best you can hope for from a governor's wife." She set down her cup. "And your husband?" Elizabeth considered the question with her customary honesty. "He is learning," she said. "Learning what? How to see me," Elizabeth said. Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she said with a directness that Elizabeth had come to appreciate, "And are you letting him?" Elizabeth thought about the ring in her pocket. She had carried it there every day. Not worn it. Not put it away. Kept it with her the way you keep something you are still deciding about, the way you keep a question you are not ready to answer but are not willing to stop asking. "Yes," she said. Slowly. Carefully. "Good," Margaret said with the satisfaction of a woman who has watched a great many things resolve incorrectly and is pleased to see one going right. Slowly and carefully is how the good things happen. Yet, on a Tuesday evening in late August, exactly 5 weeks after the night she had walked out of this same room, Elizabeth stood in the Ashford Manor entrance hall and put on her gloves. They were going to the Hargrove dinner, both of them. Together as the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, as Hargrove had requested, as the county now understood them to be. Not because a contract said so, not because convention required it, but because they had both chosen in the preceding 5 weeks to do the difficult work of becoming people who could make that choice honestly. William came down the stairs in his good coat, and he stopped when he saw her, and she saw him take her in, not the way he had looked at her for 11 months through her past. Her at the more interesting thing beyond her. He looked at her. Directly. The particular attention of a man who has learned that what is directly in front of him is worth seeing. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she said. He offered his arm. She took it. Not the way a woman takes a man's arm because the rules of society require it. The way a person takes the arm of someone they have decided to walk beside because they have decided it freely and with full knowledge of what the decision means and what it cost to get here. Thomas opened the front door. Outside, the carriage waited in the warm August evening, the same carriage that had carried her away from this house 5 weeks ago in the dark, The same lamps burning at its corners, the same patient driver on his box. The same vehicle that had been an escape was now simply transportation. A way to get from one place to another. A carriage. Nothing more and nothing less. And what it meant was entirely determined by who was inside it and what they carried with them. Elizabeth descended the front steps of Ashford Manor on her husband's arm. She felt the ring in her pocket. Present, patient. Waiting for its right moment. The way good things wait, not desperately, not anxiously, but with the settled confidence of something that knows it belongs somewhere and is simply waiting to arrive. She stepped up into the carriage. William sat beside her, not across from her, which was different, and which mattered, and which she allowed herself to notice. The door closed. The carriage began to move, and Elizabeth Ashford, née Carter, who had arrived at this house as a transaction and stayed as a ghost and discovered a crime and carried its proof through 7 months of careful, invisible, underestimated work, sat in the warm August evening beside the man she was learning slowly and honestly to know, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not rescued, not vindicated, not triumphant, simply herself. Fully, completely, without apology, and without cost. Herself. And that she knew that was the thing no one could take from you once you had claimed it. Not a husband's indifference, not a rival's calculation, not a society's contempt, not 11 months of being looked through like glass. Once you had stood in your own truth and refused to be moved. You carried that standing with you everywhere you went, in every room you entered for the rest of your life. The carriage rolled through the Virginia summer evening toward the Hargrove house, and inside it, a woman who had been told in 100 different ways to make herself smaller, sat with her spine straight and her hands still and her chin level, and she was not small. She had never been small. She had simply been waiting for the world around her to grow large enough to see her clearly. It had. And she was ready.